Remember the tiger in Life of Pi? His name was Richard Parker, honoring a real-life cabin boy who met a tragic fate. In 1884, an incident occurred in the Atlantic Ocean so shocking that it would forever be etched into English law to prevent such horrors from happening again. This is that horrifying story. As a special thank you, we are excited to announce a free giveaway of an exclusive 3D printed model of the Titanic ship. This detailed model features a realistic rendering of the ship's hull, deck structures, smokestacks, and lifeboats, showcasing the Titanic's distinct appearance. Don't miss your chance to win, participate through the link in the description, or secure your own model by purchasing it on our website. There's a name that's become so synonymous with maritime tragedy that anyone who has it is recommended to keep both feet firmly planted on dry land for life. That name? Richard Parker. It all began in 1797. When a man named Richard Parker was a lead conspirator in a naval mutiny. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for him. When his plans were discovered, he was hanged from his own ship's yardarm. Ouch. Fast forward 40 years, and Edgar Allan Poe decided to immortalize the name in his novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. In it, a character named Richard Parker led a mutiny aboard a ship called the Grampus, which eventually wrecked. Stranded in the vast ocean in a dinghy with no supplies, Richard and the other survivors faced torturous hunger and thirst. Richard, ever the practical one, suggested they invoke the custom of the sea, a tradition no sailor ever wants to be a part of, but was sadly fitting for their predicament. This brilliant idea backfired on Richard in the most horrific way possible. But even that isn't the final Richard Parker. It's often said that fact is stranger than fiction, and boy does this story prove it. And in 1884, another Richard Parker would be entered into maritime legend and law books as part of a legal precedent still taught today. On May 19th of that year, a yacht known as the Mignonette left port from Southampton, England, with 4 men aboard: Captain Tom Dudley, crewman Ed Brooks, and Edwin Stevens, and Richard Parker, the cabin boy. The yacht had been bought by a wealthy Australian man, and the crew's job was to deliver the boat to him. Tom got the job because he had a long reputation as an excellent sailor and a man of integrity and honesty. He was also a natural leader for both experienced and inexperienced men alike. Ed and Edwin were also seasoned, experienced sailors who had seen it all at sea. But for 17-year-old Richard, this would be his first big open water voyage. He came from a family of seafarers and was no stranger to sailing, but the extent of his experience had been in shallower coastal waters. Despite this, it was a trip he looked forward to with both excitement and apprehension. His concerns eased after a few days on the open ocean. Their trip from Southampton to Australia was long, requiring the ship to sail south past Europe, around Africa, and finally across the Indian Ocean to Australia. For more than a month, the crew faced very little trouble. The weather, short of a few squalls here and there, was cooperative, and the seas remained mostly calm, which the men were thankful for given the small size of their ship. The Mignonette was only 52 feet, 16 meters long, and getting it to Australia required 15,000 miles of sailing. In fact, this was such a dangerous task that the wealthy Australian owner struggled to even form a crew to deliver it. Yachts, for the most part, weren't built for this type of journey, but unfortunately there was no other way to get the Mignonette to its new owner. So the 4 men aboard the ship stayed cautious while still enjoying sailing in pristine conditions. All of this would change around 1,500 miles off the coast of Africa when the Mignonette was traveling from the Portuguese island of Madeira to Cape Town, South Africa. On July 5th, the yacht was ahead of a storm. Tom then gave the order to perform something called a heave-to. This is a way to adjust the sails and rudder so that they counteract one another, allowing the boat to stay fairly stationary even in a storm. If done correctly, the boat's bow will also be pointed slightly off-wind to reduce the impact of the waves. When Tom gave the order late at night, the men performed the heave-to, and as it was just about to be complete, he sent Richard below deck to grab him a cup of tea. As Richard got below deck though, a rogue wave smashed into the yacht, basically removing one entire side of it. Seeing this, Tom knew there was no chance of keeping the Mignonette above water and ordered that the lifeboat be lowered immediately. In less than 5 minutes, the yacht was gone. The Mignonette was already on its way to the bottom of the ocean, and the 4 stunned men watched from their small dinghy, which was barely suitable for a day of fishing on a calm lake. The boards that made up the lifeboat were only 1/4 of an inch, 6 millimeters thick. If that wasn't bad enough, lowering the lifeboat had punctured a small hole in its hull. This was just the beginning of their troubles. Before the ship sank, Tom managed to grab only 2 1-pound tins of canned turnips and a chronometer, an instrument used for navigation. When the storm cleared, they found that there wasn't a speck of land in sight, and they had no drinkable water for the 4 of them. And if that wasn't bad enough, on their first night, a shock began bumping the lifeboat around, causing the crew to have to beat it back with their oars. For 2 days, the 4 men ate and drank nothing at all. Then, Tom pulled out one of the cans of turnips and divided them into 5 pieces, which were rationed out to the men over the next 2 days, but it was obviously not nearly enough to survive on for long. Around July 9th, in a stroke of luck, Ed spotted a sea turtle, and Edwin was able to capture it. With no way to cook it, they had to eat it raw. The turtle, with about 3 pounds of meat, sustained them for a few extra days and stretched their supply of turnips. Unfortunately, killing the turtle was difficult and messy, and its blood became contaminated with seawater, so they weren't able to drink it. They did manage to consume the rest of it, but the turnips and turtle were completely gone by mid-July. As they got closer to dying of dehydration, the 4 men tried to catch rainwater to drink, but other than a few sips here and there, they weren't able to collect nearly enough to quench their thirst. Things got so bad that they started drinking their own urine, which only dehydrated them faster. Contrary to popular belief, this dehydrates the body faster than not drinking anything at all. Additionally, the water content of urine decreases with each ingestion, making it more concentrated with harmful waste. After a few more days, Richard couldn't take the pain of dehydration anymore, and leaned over the side of the dinghy, lapping up seawater by the handful. Unlike drinking urine, it was already well known that drinking seawater was a big mistake. Had Richard had a small amount, he might have been fine, but drinking it in large quantities was likely a death sentence. When he drank his fill, he immediately felt relief, but hours later, he became violently ill with diarrhea, which only dehydrated him more. Another day later, Richard's condition worsened, and he collapsed onto the bottom of the dinghy, unable to move. Meanwhile, the other 3 were not much better off. They were ravenously hungry and very close to dying of thirst. It was then, as they watched Richard lying helplessly, that Tom brought up the custom of the sea. Edwin was unsure about it, and Ed flat out refused to agree. That night, Richard deteriorated even more, and was clearly close to death. In the morning, Tom brought up the topic again, but once again, Ed rebuffed him. Beyond the obvious reason that no one wants to eat another person, there was another good reason for his hesitancy. The custom of the sea required serious consideration because agreeing to it meant putting one's own life on the line. It required that everyone draw straws to determine the fate of one of the survivors. Whoever drew the shortest straw would be sacrificed so the others could live, meaning the loser would be eaten. This custom was reserved for the most dire situations and was as barbaric as it gets. But the way it was done, or said to have been done, was always strict to the letter. In an odd way, there was a supposed integrity to the process that sailors at the time honored. The rules were unwritten, but as sailors understood them, there was very little room for interpretation. These are the 3 requirements that had to be met for the custom of the sea to be performed. First, the situation had to be a dire one of life or death, on the verge of starvation or dehydration. Second, the decision had to be unanimous among the survivors. If even one person was against the idea, it could go no further. Third, the selection process had to be fair, giving each sailor an equal chance to end up being chosen. Incredibly, at the time, although not what you might call socially acceptable, there was more of an understanding of this practice. If the custom was performed to the letter and the selection was fair, participating in it was seen as nothing to hide, even if it was still an incredibly difficult subject. There was a sort of grudging recognition of its necessity under certain circumstances, and because of the many dangers of the sea, the custom was not as rare as you might hope. The threat of a shipwreck during this time period was very real, and many unfortunate crews were left to make the decision to sacrifice one of their own, so the others could live. Legally, however, countries struggled to determine how to handle the custom, while wrestling with the question of whether or not a murder could be justified by the necessity of a dire situation. For example, in the 1600s, 7 English sailors were lost at sea for more than 2 weeks and, like the crew of the Mignonette, had very few supplies in their lifeboat. In a twist of fate, the man who proposed the custom of the sea was the very same one who drew the short straw. When the survivors were rescued, they were returned to the Caribbean island of St. Christopher to stand trial for murder. However, the remaining survivors were pardoned after the judge found that the killing was indeed a necessity. In another example, in 1820, a whaling ship called the Essex was rammed by a whale and its survivors were scattered into 3 small boats. During their survival ordeal, 6 died from either starvation or exposure, and 1 was sacrificed, chosen by the custom after drawing straws. A man named Owen was the unfortunate crewman who pulled the short one. His sacrifice allowed the others to live and ultimately survive the ordeal. Back on the little dinghy, later that night, Tom brought up the custom again, only this time with a slight change in his proposition. Instead of drawing straws, he proposed that they just sacrifice Richard since it appeared he was going to die anyway. If that was the case, he might as well die so that the other 3 could live long enough to hopefully be rescued. Once again though, Ed would not hear of it. He found the idea repulsive and was surprised that someone of Tom's character and distinction would even suggest it. For Edwin, on the other hand, the idea began to make sense. As Tom pointed out, each of them had wives and multiple children, while Richard was still a teenager. It would be better for a single man to die than for many children to grow up without fathers. With this suggestion, tension began to rise in the dinghy, even though Ed was against the idea. Since it was 2 against 1 and Tom had already decided to forego the rules, his protest might mean nothing in the end. But either way, no decision was made that night, and the men agreed to sleep on it. As the next day wore on, and there was still no sign of land or life anywhere, Tom and Edwin made eye contact, which they both took as silent agreement to Tom's plan. For a moment, Tom paused to say a prayer, while Edwin slowly knelt down at the bottom of the dinghy. When Tom was ready, Edwin grabbed hold of Richard's legs to keep him from flailing, and Tom brought his penknife down into Richard's neck. Edwin continued to hold him down while Tom grabbed the case for the chronometer and began filling it from the wound he had just made. When enough of it had accumulated, he drank from the case before handing it to Edwin, who did the same. Edwin then extended it to Ed, who was stunned and horrified by what he was witnessing. Reluctantly though, he took the case, and the liquid filled his dry mouth for the first time in days. When Richard had passed, Tom and Edwin undressed him and began removing the edible portions. Finally, they were full and satisfied for the first time since catching the turtle. Tom and Edwin continued to remove the edible portions, eating raw meat as long as it remained fresh. For the next 4 days, the 3 consumed as much as they could before it started to rot. Hunger set back in soon after, but on July 29th, only a few days after killing Richard, they finally saw a ship coming toward them. A German vessel named the Montezuma was on its way to Hamburg when it spotted the dinghy and brought Tom, Edwin, and Ed on board. When they picked up the 3 survivors, the crew of the ship couldn't help but notice the state of the dinghy. The inside was coated in blood, and some of the remains were still on board. This obviously led to a lot of questions, but Tom told them everything. As captain, he felt justified in the decision because it was done out of necessity, a survival practice more understood at the time. This didn't really lessen the impact, but then, even more stunning for the crew of the Montezuma, Tom insisted on bringing the rotting remains on board so they could be given a proper Christian burial in England. It took more than a month for the ship to finish its journey, and when it arrived on September 6th in England, the Montzuma's captain accompanied Tom, Edwin, and Ed to see the customs officer and report their arrival. The 4 men then met with customs, and Tom explained the ordeal of being set adrift at sea and what happened to Richard. As he did, a local police sergeant was in the room, listening in on everything. Given the disturbing events he just learned, the sergeant didn't know what to do with the 3 men and sought legal advice while keeping them detained. The captain and crew of the Montezuma were also not allowed to leave for Hamburg during this time because they'd be crucial witnesses if there were any legal proceedings. After a brief investigation that included multiple interviews, Tom, Edwin, and Ed were charged with Richard's murder. Tom, more than anyone else, was shocked by this. In his view, anyone else in the same situation would have done the same thing. What Tom didn't know was that the English legal system was looking for an opportunity to establish murder at sea as a punishable crime. The law was still without a set precedent in cases of violent death at the hands of others at sea until the crew of the Mignonette arrived back in England. So in the days following their return, Tom, Edwin, and Ed were taken for arraignment. During this, and after learning of Ed's unwillingness to participate in Richard's killing, he was allowed to go free without penalty. Either way, this case and story were covered feverishly by European media. The story had sensational elements that gripped the public, and sentiment was mostly in favor of Tom and Edwin's decision. There was even an occasion for Tom and Edwin to meet Richard's brother Daniel, who shook both their hands. As a sailor, Daniel believed they made the right decision. However, the judge who would hear the case made it clear as the trial got started in November that there was no justification for killing another human being that the law would recognize. Many viewed this as clear favoritism shown toward the prosecutors. Additionally, being found guilty of murder at the time meant immediate execution, so if Tom and Edwin were found guilty, they would be put to death. But when the jury finished their deliberations, they came to a unanimous decision that all of the men would have died if they hadn't done what they did. There was a caveat though. The judge had informed the jury prior to deliberations that they would have the option of returning a special verdict. By doing so, the jury would collectively recognize they couldn't tell if Tom and Edwin were guilty of murder, and that's exactly the verdict they opted for. As a result, the case was sent to a higher court consisting of 5 judges and no jury. Little time was wasted between the decision and the higher court beginning its proceedings. This is where some sticky legal topics were sorted out. The defense argued that Richard's killing was a necessity based on the context of the situation. The problem with that argument was that it had never been made before, so the trial was as much about the validity of that claim as it was about determining the guilt or innocence of Tom and Edwin. Afterward, 2 different precedents were presented to the judges. The first was killing in self-defense, recognized as a necessity in certain cases. For example, if Richard had fought back and Tom ended up dead, this would be considered justifiable homicide. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that English law did not justify murder under necessity. A homeless man who steals a loaf of bread because he's starving is not justified in doing so, even though the theft was out of necessity. In the end, the judges sided with the prosecution, and Tom and Edwin were sentenced to death. However, public opinion was on their side throughout the trial. Even after the verdict and sentence were handed down, the court felt pressured to pardon them due to the overwhelming support from citizens of the United Kingdom. This is what the media expected to happen next. Then, a few days passed with no word of a pardon, and it looked bleak for Tom and Edwin. Thankfully for them, instead of a pardon, the court commuted the sentence down to just 6 months in prison. This was the first time any country had made any sort of legal decision on how to handle the custom of the sea, and the case remains a foundational reference to this day. So I'm curious, legal issues aside, since it's clearly understood what would happen if it were to happen today, what would you have done in the same situation as the men on the dinghy? Would you have drawn straws as per tradition, chosen the weakest like they did? Or is there some other scenario that makes more sense? Let me know down in the comments what you think you would have done. And now, time for the giveaway. We'll be giving away this Titanic 3D printed model, which will be shipped to your location anywhere in the world. To participate, simply leave a comment down below telling us what you think about this discovery. We're excited to hear about your thoughts. Once you've commented, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have notifications turned on so you won't miss out on any future giveaways or videos from us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. The winner will be randomly selected and announced, so stay tuned for that. If you're the lucky winner, we'll get in touch with you directly to arrange the shipping. Also, if you like the 3D model and want to order it, you can buy it now from the description link down below. Good luck everyone, we can't wait to read your comments. From everyone here, thank you so much for watching, and as always, keep the passion alive. Until the next video, take care and see you soon.